In this week's In-Ear Insights, we're talking about data analytics. And data analytics is kind of a really big umbrella term that doesn't have a super clear definition, particularly when you compare it to things like business analytics, marketing analytics, and so on and so forth. Uh, Fundamentally, data analytics is the discipline or profession of data analysis, right? Just like marketing analytics is the profession of marketing analysis. So, Katie, when you think about data analytics and analyzing data as such a huge, broad, vague term, what springs to mind?
Well, it's interesting that you're talking about the lack of a definition because for the longest time, I thought data analytics was a redundant thing. It sounded to me like data and data or analytics and analytics. And I think that that's part of the confusion around what it is. But it's the act of analyzing the data that you have, which, to be quite honest, is to me when I think of it, it does the word data itself almost becomes irrelevant because if you say business analytics or marketing analytics, you need data in order to do the analysis, or else you're analyzing literally nothing. So, 0 times 0 is still 0. And so that's sort of where my head goes is the word data in some ways, it's not that it's misleading, it's just not descriptive enough because it really does apply to anything. Um, because at the core of it, like you need that data in order to do the analysis. And so I feel like call it whatever you want. You can't get around the fact that if you have terrible, you know, processes for collecting data, really bad governance, bad data quality, it doesn't matter what you call it, it's still going to be terrible in the end.
It's sort of second on the rung of a very short ladder. But you think about it, you have data engineering at the bottom, which is the storage and manipulation of data, how to
Mhm.
run a database, how to store data properly, how to retrieve it, how to back it up, the things that you need to make the stuff work. Then you have
Mhm.
data analytics, which is the analysis of all that stuff that you stored. Again, very generic. And then on top of that, you have data science, which is the experimentation and application of the scientific method on the data, particularly on the analysis that you've done to understand the data. So there is kind of a logical progression to this very, very vague, broad term. And when we unpack data analytics, you can split it into kind of five areas, right? There's descriptive analytics, which is what happened, diagnostic analytics, which is trying to understand why those things happen, predictive analytics, which is trying to forecast from your data, prescriptive analytics, which is trying to make recommendations from your predictions, and then proactive analytics, where you're building systems to essentially manage the data analysis on automatically, where you don't have to touch it. It just does its thing. And so this hierarchy within data analytics is a nice set of clues to what data analytics should be. And again, like you said, it can apply to anything that has data, right? So it's sort of
Mhm.
an umbrella set of disciplines. And this is where you have now transferable skills, right? If you're good at descriptive analytics in marketing, you probably can take those same skills and port them to sales or port them to finance, because at the end of the day, you still got data that you're trying to analyze.
So, I appreciate the explanation, but I'm still, it's funny. We've talked about it a bunch, but I get stuck on the order of data engineering, data analysis, data science, because you're talking about applying the scientific method to the data you're analyzing. And to me, and maybe this is just how my brain operates, it almost feels like those are backward. And so, because I feel like because to me, the scientific method in some ways is a plan. It's a plan of how you're going to approach the data analysis. And I feel like if you're doing the data analysis and then applying data science on top of it, you've done it in the wrong order.
I would disagree with you there, because data analytics and data analysis tells you what's in the box to begin with. If you don't know what's in the box, you can't design experiments around it. It to me, that is putting the cart before the horse. If I don't even know what's in my Google Analytics account, I can't set up Google Optimize, for example. Like, I could set up Google Optimize, but I would have no idea what I'm measuring. Whereas if I set up Google Analytics first, like, okay, now I know what's in there. Now I can start to design experiments around it.
I think you've just described the number one problem of the majority of companies is that cart before the horse. So, I've seen a lot of companies and our clients talk about Google Optimize, and we're like, yeah, but where's Google Analytics? And I think that kind of mindset is just it's not shared. It's not the understanding of, if you set this up first, then you can do all of these things. People are like, no, I need to test in order to know what to set up. And so I think that is a lot of where data analytics gets confused. Even I was just saying, like, to me, it feels like it's backward, but you're absolutely right. You need to have the thing set up first before, you can do the experiment. If I think back to my fourth grade science class where I was learning about the scientific method, you have to have all of your materials set up in front of you before you can start the experiment. So I guess it is, that does, as you're describing, it makes a heck of a lot more sense to me now.
Exactly. It's like cooking, right? Like you probably should know what ingredients you have before you start trying
Yeah,
to make
you just
different
wing it.
variations. You can. There are consequences.
Mhm,
But I think that's the confusion about it. Like you said, data analytics, A, it sounds redundant, even though it's not. And B, it's so broad because it's describing a set of skills
mhm,
rather than, well, here, let's put it this way. Because this is something I was talking about this past weekend. In everything we have, there's verticals and horizontals. Verticals like marketing, finance, HR, manufacturing, farming, etc. And then horizontals are things like analytics skills, data science skills, right? Engineering skills, management skills. And it's those intersections that you have to look at and say, okay, well, when I take analytics as a skill, as a broad set of skills, and I intersect it with marketing, now I have marketing analytics. But when we say data analytics as a whole, it's that entire horizontal band. So the skills that you have in analytics can go from marketing to finance to agriculture
mhm.
relatively unchanged. But because we don't think of horizontals very much in our skill sets when we're talking about people, it sounds redundant and confusing. In the same way that you would say you have a manager, right? And in a PR firm, you have an account manager. Whereas at a retail store, you might have a store manager. It's still a manager,
Mhm.
and you have management skills, but you'd be talking about management overall as a horizontal skill set. And how do you move that from vertical to vertical? So data analytics is the whole horizontal, and we have to break it down into the different categories.
It's interesting that you bring that up because we'll be talking about the people doing your marketing strategy on our live stream this week, which is every Thursday at 1 p.m. You can catch it on our YouTube live channel. Um, and I think that you just hit on one of the big challenges with data analytics is the people. And so not thinking about what kinds of skill sets you need. Yes, if you can, run a mean Excel spreadsheet, your skills are likely transferable because data is data is data. But then when you get into the nuance of each vertical, of each industry, understanding the definitions of these things, having a data dictionary, I mean, I could probably still recite for you the full data dictionary of the 3,000 variables in the assessment tool that I worked on 10 years ago, but it means nothing to the job that I do today. So it doesn't really help anything. And so that's not a transferable set of skills other than just like a cool party trick. So I need to now understand the different verticals of data as they apply today. However, my data analytics skills are transferable across all of those verticals. So it is interesting to think about it in that respect because, what we'll be, as I mentioned, what we'll be talking about is the lack of thought around the people who have to do the thing.
Exactly. To your example, yes, it is a cool party trick to be able to recite all 3,000 variables. Also makes it really easy to design long passwords. Uh,
Hmm.
but the principle of designing a data dictionary, which is more of a data engineering skill than it is a data analytics skill,
Hmm.
that is 100% transferable. And if you look in the vertical of marketing,
Hmm.
it's entirely absent. We don't do that at all. Like I was just working on a paper on TikTok and looking at the 41 different variables that are available.
Hmm.
There's no dictionary for it. Literally, this paper is the first time I've ever seen it written down, like, here's what these things mean.
Hmm.
Until then, it was just kind of this black box. And so you can't do data analytics, the profession, on this TikTok data because without having done the data engineering first to say, well,
Hmm.
what is in this box? I have no idea. Like, there's 41 different variables. What do they all mean? What are the format are they? And in marketing in general, that's just not there. When you look at what Facebook gives you from its reporting, right? It gives you that lovely spreadsheet with 44 tabs. And
Hmm.
you're like, up yours, Zuckerberg. But that's an engineering problem that then becomes an analytics problem.
Mhm. Well, and another really good example of that, we've been working with one of our clients who are using both Google Analytics and Adobe Analytics. And so the definitions between each system vary. So, let's say, for example, each system captures session. Okay, you could say, all right, well, a session here is the same as a session here. Not necessarily, because you then have to dig deeper into the engineering of how that variable was constructed to say, is it a session that lasts 30 seconds? Is it a session that lasts 30 days? Those are two very different variables, even though they're named the same thing and theoretically capture the same amount of information.
So here's a question for you: since you've done the engineering side in designing assessments and things as well as the analysis side,
Mhm.
when you see a governance problem in analytics, how often is it an actual data analytics problem? And how often is it actually a data engineering problem where the engineering was done poorly enough that that problem now bleeds through into analytics?
I would say it's almost 100% of the time a data engineering problem because there is, we all do it. We tend just to rush to get the thing set up because doing requirements, doing all of that, documentation up front, aside from me, everybody hates doing it. But there's a reason that you need to do it. There's a reason why, my old epidemiology team, they had this, like, I don't even know if, like, it was like 4 encyclopedias thick of SPSS syntax that every time we introduced a new variable had to be updated. And there was constantly complaints of, like, why can't we just, do the thing? Why do we have to document it? Well, you have knowledge transfers. You have that QA process of, okay, the analysis didn't come out correctly. Where did it break? Did we capture everything? Did we forget anything? Does introducing a new variable break the whole syntax, which is essentially the script to run the analysis? And I would say a lot of the time, it's just that data engineering of how is the variable constructed? What elements does it contain? How is it captured? Because that's a big part of what's forgotten. Now I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent, in terms of, so let's say I collect user information and I'm like, okay, great, so we're going to collect the person's demographic information. Well, what does that mean? Are we collecting first name? Are we collecting last name? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, is it one single field? Is it two fields? Is it first name as its own field? Do we care about case sensitivity? What about stray characters? All of those things that go into constructing a variable. And then if we don't consider those things when we're doing the data engineering side, it's all going to be foobarred on the data analysis side because you didn't set it up correctly in the first place. So that's my little tangent, definitely having been there, done that multiple times.
So then when you are managing a data division of some kind of a company, how do you remediate those engineering problems? Especially if you put yourself in the shoes of like a marketing manager, you're
Mhm.
like, okay, I need to do my reporting. And you know that the fundamental underpinnings, the foundation on which that reporting is built, is shaky at best.
I think that's when you start going back through, and you can't retroactively necessarily change the information, but you can start to put more processes in place as you're auditing the system that you're working within. And so, you can prioritize it by, your KPIs. What are the most important metrics versus what are the least important metrics? And maybe you actually do the reverse, where the metrics that are the least important are the ones that I start to correct because they have the least amount of impact on the overall report. It that choice really depends on, what the situation is. A big part of that comes back to the people and that communication. And so a few weeks ago, we recorded an episode of this podcast about analytics amnesty and talking through, if you know that everything is incorrect, what does that look like to get your organization to have a correct set of data? That analytics amnesty of making sure that everybody knows on this date, this will change. This is the new process. Everybody has to buy into the process. Everybody has to sign off on this information, has to be part of changing that. And that's not a small ask. And so if you're a marketing manager in a large organization, it may feel like an impossible task. And so I would say the way to start there is to start to prioritize the data and start to do almost like a risk assessment. What is the like how big is the risk of us not fixing this thing? What are the impacts? Is it a financial impact? Is it a customer impact? Is it a, overall ratings impact? And start to break it down that way so that when you're having the conversation with, the teams or the stakeholders, whoever it is who has to be involved in this, they then have a frame of reference of if we don't fix this thing, this is what's going to happen. The sky will literally fall, or nobody's going to notice, so we can let it go for a while.
Okay. So what about situations where you don't have control over the engineering? So for example, if you're using Google Analytics, you have literally zero control over the overall data engineering. You have no control over the variables that come out. You have no say in how the data is collected. To your point earlier, when we were talking about different analytic systems, they have different standards of collection. We have absolutely no say in the matter whatsoever with systems like Google Analytics or Google Search Console and things like that. And yet we are still tasked with providing analysis from them. In those situations, what do you do?
And that goes back to your point about those data dictionaries and something that isn't done a whole lot in marketing, but making sure that everyone who's involved is 100% clear on the definition of this variable. And so this is going to be a poor example, but let's say I need to know, down to the second, the information about people who are hitting my website. But for some reason, the way that the website visits are collected, it's, a 60-minute window, but I needed a shorter window. I need whoever's doing the analysis to help me understand what that means. And so maybe it's putting a little bit of a data dictionary at the head of the report or at the end of the report so that as I'm looking at it and saying, these aren't the numbers that I need, or these aren't the numbers that I thought I wanted, I can then have a frame of reference like, oh, okay, this number is never going to get me the thing that I need. Maybe there's a different alternative for how I can look at that information.
Right. That was where I was going to go with that, which is fundamentally you either can't make the decision because the data is not there if you don't have the second level data, or you have to build your own. You have to build your own system if it is that mission critical. That goes back to KPI mapping. If by the second data is mission critical, you're probably going to have to roll your own because what you've got from off the shelf tools is not going to be okay. And at least on that side, if you do that, then you at least have control over the data engineering. You will just have a lot more work.
Well, and that's exactly it. That is not a small ask either, to sort of build your own system that takes and manipulates the existing data in such a way that you want it to operate. No, it may be straightforward. You may have a full team of people, but I know a lot of marketing agencies don't necessarily have that kind of discipline, which goes back to the conversation about the people who are doing the work. And so, if I, as, a out of touch bossy CEO, come to you, Chris, my data scientist, and I start making demands, your job is to help me understand what's realistic. And if the things that I think that I need are so mission critical, what kinds of skill sets do you have versus what's missing? And that's the kind of conversation that the people should be having about the data.
Exactly. And it's something that we like to say to folks, the answer's never no, The
Mhm.
answer is always how much are you willing to invest in it to get that answer, because everything is measurable. Everything, you can get data on anything. The question is whether it's worthwhile doing or not. Second level data may be great, but if you're going to spend $1 million on building a new tracking system, maybe the decision's not worth that much. And that brings us to the last level in this hierarchy. You have data engineering, which is
Mhm.
the stuff. You have data analytics, which is analyzing stuff. You have data science, which is proving the stuff. And then you have data decisioning at the top of the ladder, which is the decisions you make from the first three layers. And it is very much like a building, a structure. Each layer's ability to be useful is contingent on the previous layer's stability, on its structural soundness. So if you have fundamental engineering problems, none of the rest is possible. You will literally have something that's like from Monty Python, where you build a castle in the swamp and it falls over. You build another one, it falls over. Build a third one, it falls over. The fourth one burned down, fell over, and sank into the swamp. But the fifth one stayed up because it's not built on the ruins of the first four. And the same thing is true in data, except that the swamp is never ending. So you can build as many failed structures on top of it as possible. You will never get caught up unless you fix the previous layer. When you have to explain to stakeholders, hey, you can't make data-driven decisions. Like, you cannot legitimately claim to be data-driven because the data, the analysis, and the experiments are all fundamentally flawed. How do you communicate that to somebody when they're so hell-bent on saying, yeah, we're a data-driven whatever, we're a data-driven PR agency, and you're like, that's not true.
I feel like it starts with, telling people that they're wrong, telling people that they're doing things wrong, at least in my experience, never goes over very well because people will get defensive. And so the way that I start to handle that is I start to, look in my bag of tricks and I start to pull out things like user stories. And so I would say to you, Chris, okay, Chris, as the chief data scientist, I want to be data driven so that my friends are impressed by me. Great. That's your user story. So then we can start to walk backward and be like, okay, in order to be data driven, you need to be using data. And I can start asking this question of what data are you using? It's all anecdotal. It doesn't matter. It's fine. Okay, so we know that anecdotal data does not necessarily mean that you're data driven. So let's try again. What data do you have access to? And so that's how I approach that is I try to walk it backward of let me understand what it is you're really trying to do by using a user story. And then we can start to more gently problem solve. And the reason I like to do that is because the person that I'm working with, the stakeholder that I'm working with, they need to buy into this whole narrative. And when I say buy in, I don't mean like it's a fake narrative, they need to buy into it, but they need to buy into this is the process that will get them to where they want to be. So they need to be, hand in hand with me the whole way. As I'm trying to problem solve, they need to be the ones coming up with the solutions, not me. And so I may already know what the solution is, but if they don't also see the solution, which is, oh, we need to be using data to be data driven, it's never going to work. And so you need to engage the people in the solution part of the process so that they feel like they have ownership over it.
See, I was going to say, if your friends are impressed by your use of data, you might want to get some better friends.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole different topic for a different day.
um, so I would say, to sort of wrap up, when we talk about data analytics, we are talking about one piece of a multi-level structure.
Mhm.
Engineering, which is where the data is; analysis, data analytics, the profession or the discipline of analyzing data, regardless of the vertical; data science, which is the application of the scientific method to your data to prove things that you think you found in data analytics, or to prove things that you want to experiment; and then decisioning, the ability for you to make decisions from your analysis, your insights, and your experiments, so that you can hopefully get better results than you would get by simply guessing or doing what you've always done. Now, if you are in a situation where one or more of those layers is broken, you have to fix the previous layer before you can move on. So, if you've got comments or questions or thoughts about the data hierarchy and data analytics in specific, you want to share those questions, pop on over to our free Slack. Go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, where you and over 2,200 other marketers are asking and answering each other's questions every single day. And wherever it is you watch or listen to this show, if there's a challenge you prefer to have it on, we probably have it. Go to trustinsights.ai/TI podcast, where you can listen. You can even catch little snippets, on like TikTok and stuff. But thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.